Welcome, everyone, to the Masculine Wilderness podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez from the Epic Project. This podcast and all of our work with Epic is about nurturing a generation of generative men. And today's guest is a shining example of exactly that. While we come from different backgrounds, we desire to see boys grow into whole and healthy men. In her new book, BOYMOM, author Ruth Whitman speaks to the unique challenges boys face. She's an academic, a loving mother of young boys, and I'm just looking forward to this conversation for a couple of real personal reasons, but the main one is I raised 3 girls.
Oh.
But now I have 2 grandsons. So it's become real for me in a way that I actually didn't anticipate. So we want to give this time over to just talking about this space that we find ourselves in these days. So I can't wait to get into the book and the motivation behind it. But Ruth, welcome to this podcast. And I would love for you to just take a few moments. Tell us about yourself. What are the things we need to know about you?
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me on the show. I have to say, I would love to claim that I was an academic, but I am not an academic. I am a journalist. And so I don't have any deep academic expertise. I think I come at this issue, I started writing this book. Here it is, BOYMOM. And I wrote this book as a mom of 3 boys. I have 3 sons who are nearly 14, nearly 11 and 6. And I'm also a journalist. So my background is in taking on complex topics and trying to figure out what's going on and reporting them out. So my 3rd son, my youngest, was born right as the Me Too movement was just exploding online. I was 9 months pregnant, about to go into labor. And I read about Weinstein. We were a year into the Trump administration. And every time I opened up my phone, there was just another terrible story about another terrible man. I'm about to be raising 3 boys into men. I think in that moment, the conversation about gender and about masculinity and about so-called toxic masculinity just took off in a way that was really new. We were talking about gender in a very different way. And we were talking about men and the sort of harms that men have caused in a much more systemic way. It was no longer oh, here's another bad apple and here's another isolated incident. It's there's something wrong in the culture. And as somebody who was raising 3 sons, as someone who's a feminist, who's always identified as a feminist, I just wanted to dig in, what are the deeper forces at work? Where are we going wrong with raising boys? And what's happening at a kind of systemic level? It's not just what every individual happens to do in their own home. It's something deep in the culture that I wanted to look into and figure out.
And you do that so astutely. But one of the things I want to say up front is, as I was reading through it, and I read it carefully, what also comes through loud and clear is the heart of a loving mother.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you say that, because I wrote this book and my approach was always from a point of love and care for my sons. And no, it was a really difficult moment, I think, as a feminist and as a mother of boys. Those things could sometimes feel in conflict with each other. And a lot of the sort of feminist discourse is if we center boys, we're somehow taking away from women and girls. And at certain moments, some of the kind of conversation around toxic masculinity made me feel really defensive about my own boys, and you're calling them toxic and this is terrible. And I had a lot of conflicted feelings, but it does come from a place of love and just wanting to do better by them. And I believe that those things are not in conflict. I think that raising healthy boys is absolutely essential to feminism. I think the same system that harms women and girls harms men and boys, and we can all benefit from changing the culture.
Well, and I would say too, as an older guy who read this, who I am a product of the very culture that you're trying to dive into and understand. But I can say that love for boys actually comes through as a love for men. It's not, there's a lot of honesty, and it's some of it for me personally, it's hard to wrestle with the way you've unpacked it. And yet it comes in with a lot of grace. So thank you for that. I was telling this to a friend the other day. I can tell, and I'm a reader. You can see it behind me. And this is what's left of my recent culling of all my books. I got rid of hundreds of them, but I can tell a good book by how messed up the pages are when I read through them. and yours is one of them. And
I love that. Thank you.
At the risk of going like full fanboy on you, I want to just a little bit just kind of go through the pages, because there are some things there's a bunch of things that really struck me, but I tried to pull out some of hopefully the more high level issues. And if I could I'm going to read it and just ask you some questions either to
expand.
I would
love that. Yeah, I would love that. Thank you.
I have never done these conversations this way, but I want to try it. So you talk in the introduction, you talk about patriarchy, the P word that in a lot of spaces I come from, that's not a good word, but patriarchy is a system in which men hold the bulk of power politically, economically, socially, and culturally, and male concerns are centered while others are marginalized. That to me is one of the most helpful descriptions of what it is. And what I'm curious is this your own kind of synthesized description, or do others hold the same kind of view about what patriarchy is? Because that's where the conversation has to start.
Yeah, those are my words in my description, but I think I think that would generally be how people would define it. I mean, there's so much has been written about this subject, and it's, as you say, very fraught. It can bring up a lot of feelings in people. It can bring up a lot of defensiveness. But I think we can agree that in history, men have held the bulk of power politically, socially, culturally, economically, financially. And that's just true. I mean, you look at who's been the president, who runs the major companies, who is in the positions of power. All of those things are true, and who holds the money. This doesn't mean that that's the starting point. It's way more complicated than that. And I think as I unpack in the book, patriarchy doesn't mean that everything's great and A-okay for men and terrible for women. It's much more complicated than that. But I think the starting point is, yes, throughout history, men have held the bulk of the power. Yeah. And what the part about male concerns are centered while others are trivialized.
Well, on that note, you talked about, and I don't remember if it was in the introduction or further in the book, but you talked about the difference between referring to girls as sweetheart, and boys as buddy. And so that hit home for me, because I raised 3 daughters. They're still sweetheart they're in their 30s.
Yeah.
Their friends, many of whom actually over the years have lived with us, they're sweetheart. Like that's a very normal thing for me. And when I have 2 grandsons and a granddaughter, and it's real easy to call my granddaughter sweetheart. Yeah. But what I remember is I intentionally started referring to my oldest grandson that way when he was little. He's 8, almost 9 now, and I still do it, but it takes more effort. He's a big, very boyish, athletic kid, and I want to call him buddy.
Yeah. And it's a really tricky thing. I mean, it was like, so I think the buddy sweetheart thing, it's one of these examples of something which on the face of it is just like so tiny. It's such a minor thing. It's so well meant. I don't want anyone to feel like I'm shaming them for calling their son buddy, or because we know we do this out of affection. But the difference between buddy and sweetheart is like, sweetheart conveys like protectiveness, nurture, emotional engagement, whereas buddy is like this kind of backslapping, you're my peer, let's get a beer. And also it's just like a little tick away from like, hey buddy, let's get in a fight. And it's evoking masculinity. And I think there's difficulties with both of them. I mean, there's a risk that you can overanalyze every little tiny thing you do. But so when my 5-year-old went off to kindergarten for the first time, this is how it came into my mind. So he's going through the gate, his very first day at school. Picture this tiny little boy with this giant backpack that's like, he's barely like able to walk straight. This backpack's so big, and he's scared, he's anxious. And there's a guy at the gate. He's like, I don't know if he's a teacher or a volunteer or something, but he's like, sees the 2 girls in front of my son, and he's like, hi, sweetheart. And like a very nurturing voice. And they go through the gate, and he sees my son, and he's like, hey, buddy, and gives him a high five. And it's like, he is communicating not in 1 word, 2 words. You're not in need of protection and nurture. My son is every bit as anxious, every bit as vulnerable walking into that situation as the girls are. He's little, he's 5 years old. And yet suddenly we've masculinized him. We've told him to man up. We've communicated this idea that he can't show vulnerability, that he can't be a sweetheart, that he doesn't deserve the nurture and protection of the adults in his life. And this is like, if this was the only thing that ever happened, then so what? But like, it's part of a pattern where we masculinize boys right from birth, all the way through their lives. We don't allow them to be vulnerable. We don't give them the same kind of care and nurture and emotional engagement that we give to little girls. And it has long-term, these things add up. These tiny little things add up over time, and they have a really long-term impact.
I can remember, probably not that young, but I can remember as a child, those kind of exchanges where, like as a young boy, it felt like, oh, he's affirming,
my masculinity.
Masculinity. And yet I also knew that, like you said, like, I'm scared.
Yeah.
And I don't know where to go with it. Yeah.
It's both, right? And you can see the disadvantage to the girls in being called sweetheart, because like you're talking about your daughters, and obviously it's totally appropriate that a dad would call his daughter sweetheart or his like young child. But sometimes I know, and probably most women listening will know, the idea that you just get called sweetheart by like a male colleague in a meeting, and then that's patronizing, or it's like makes you smaller, and like the buddy is we're a pair. And so I think there's a way in which like you can argue that sweetheart has its own problems. But I think that we've done a good job, I'm a feminist, we've done a good job of like calling out the sort of stereotypes against girls, the ways that we like diminish girls and women. And I think we need to look at the other side of it as like, what is the cost to boys and men of being asked to like man up in all of these different subtle ways?
That is one of the most helpful things about what you've done, is shining a light on that. It's like asking a question, what is the cost of this for men? Which I think that's partly what really surprised me about your work here, is to hear a woman asking that question.
I mean, I'm really glad that you said that. One of the really big surprises about this book being out in the world is that I assumed having a title like Boy Mom, only women would read it and only moms would read it. But actually, and moms have been like the biggest group for sure that have been reading it. But I have had so many emails from men being like, thank you for writing this. You've captured something that I know but haven't been able to articulate. And I feel like the world is really hard on me in all these different ways, but nobody's been able to talk about that with any empathy. And they feel very shut down in our culture. And so I think I've been really surprised and really delighted that men have responded well to this book.
I think it touches a nerve, but then there's also a tension just a few pages later that I want to get into too, because it affects. I think if we don't call this out, our ability to actually speak to that the needs that men have and the costs that we're paying and all that. But you said, and you're talking about the difference in our current kind of political divide between the response to this. You said, while the left branded masculinity as toxic, the right sold it as the answer to all our problems. With both politicians and online influencers peddling a new brand of wounded, furious manhood drawn from a combination of superhero fantasies and defensive rage. And it's such a vivid picture of the divide.
Yes, there's a huge divide in our culture.
Yeah. I mean, we see it in our work in dealing with the active online sex buyers. I mean, you can see it, it's manifested there in 100 different ways.
Yeah.
Like in your work right now, what is maybe one of the most glaring examples of that divide? Where does it show up that you keep like experiencing it?
Yeah. I mean, well, look, I think that what I've noticed because for this book, I talked to many boys of teenage and kind of college age. And I think what they're experiencing in this moment, so I would call this like a little micro generation of boys that were going through puberty when the Me Too movement happened and this whole conversation about toxic masculinity kicked off. And they've like lived their whole adolescence in the shadow of this conversation around men, around masculinity, around male harm, around Me Too, around sexual violence, in a way that no other generation of men or boys has. This is a very new way to talk about manhood. And I think that this generation of boys, when I spoke to them, they felt very shut down, both by the left and the right. I think And what I was hearing is that like the kind of old norms and the old like prohibitions of masculinity. So this sort of like, don't talk about your feelings, be tough, be a tough guy, man up, be aggressive. They're all still like very much in circulation. So it's like squash your emotions, don't talk about your feelings. And that's coming more from the sort of right in a way, or that type of like old school masculinity. But then from the left, we've got this kind of like, you shut up, man. You've had your turn. You're so privileged. Time to be quiet. You can't speak to your own pain because it's time to give someone else a chance to speak. Don't center yourself.
Yeah.
And so you're toxic, you're terrible, and all of that. And so I think the boys that I spoke to were feeling shut down from both sides. They were like, well, the system isn't really working for us. Everyone's talking about all this privilege we have. I don't see it in my own life. It doesn't feel relevant to me. It doesn't matter that who gets to be the president or who gets to earn what on Wall Street is not really relevant to a like 16-year-old boy. They don't see the privileged side of it. They feel very shut down from both sides. And I think it's just the conversation has become really unproductive and really unhelpful.
What age would that micro generation, what would you say?
Well, I think if you were like 11 when Me Too was happening, you're now 18.
So preteen to...
Yeah, just preteen to early college. So a few years either side. But I think anyone who's an adolescent or college age now will be so aware of this conversation. Absolutely in the zeitgeist. It's so much part of their experience of what it's like to be a boy. And I think they feel like nobody's listening, nobody's empathizing, nobody wants to hear what they have to say. One of the things that was really surprising to me, I thought, oh, I'm going to interview teenage boys. It's going to be a nightmare. They're going to be so monosyllabic. They won't have a word to say. It's going to be like pulling teeth.
Yeah.
They had so much to say. They were desperate to be heard. I'd schedule like an hour of a Zoom call and they would want to talk for 2-3 hours and still be emailing me and saying, oh, I forgot to say this and I forgot to say that. They just wanted to be heard and they wanted somebody to listen. And I think we've forgot that these people are children. We're talking about Harvey Weinstein and all these terrible older sexual predators and all of this, but this is a generation of children that we're talking about, of boys. And I think growing up in the shadow of that conversation has been really unhealthy for them.
I hadn't thought of that dynamic as a part of this. And you interviewed, for this book, how many young men did you talk with?
Probably around 50. It's hard to say exactly. Some were in groups, some were one-on-one. But yeah, probably around 50 of that age group. And what I did when I was looking for them, I really didn't have an agenda. I think sometimes in journalism, it's like, you do it back to front. So it's like you have the issue, then you want to find like a person to represent that issue. And I wanted to go into this completely neutral. I was just like, any boy of that age from any background, just tell me what you have to say and I will hear it rather than like wanting to illustrate a bunch of points that I already had, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, put myself in the shoes of those young men and having someone like you ask thoughtful questions and engage them. And it sounds, and I'm saying this just as an older guy, it's just like, that sounds so, in a lot of ways, so fun and safe. You know?
I love that.
That's to do that. Cause I'm going to ask you, you may have already thought of this, but like, I would love to see you do a parallel study and interview old guys like me that have grown up in this culture. Like, I'd love to know. I would love to know the differences because...
Oh, what people say. Yeah, I mean, I would love to do that. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's quite time intensive to do it, but now I would love to. And I think the key thing is just like you're communicating to these people that you're not judging them. I don't have an agenda. I'm not there to judge them. I'm not there to say... And I think we have this impulse. And I think especially as a boy mom, it's this idea of like, we feel really fearful. Like we don't want to raise a terrible man or boy. We don't want them to become a school shooter or a sex offender or all of these awful things that can happen. And so our impulse is to lecture them and to be like this and then don't do this and don't do that. And but actually what I think they were crying out for was just someone to listen to them. What is the world as they actually experience it rather than the way that I want them to experience it or the agenda that I have for what they should be feeling and thinking.
Yeah, and they don't get that kind of attention because, I want to reference another statement in your book, we don't normally expect that of boys.
Right. It's so true. We don't expect them to want to talk about their feelings, and we stop them from talking about their feelings.
So I want to ask you a question related to that, just as more as a mom, but let me read the quote here. Boys will be boys has always been a kind of rationale for inaction, for doing less parenting. They're just wired that way. We shrug as we watch our small male humans run riot in the supermarket or bash each other with Tonka trucks or haze their fraternity brothers until someone asphyxiates. Nature lets us off the hook from nurture. That's such a wonderful statement. So my question though is, were you prepared for this reality as a mom? Like when did you, or when did this?
What it was like.
When did it really dawn on you that there was something more here?
Oh, do you mean in terms of like what it's actually like to raise boys day to day? Like,
I'm curious. Like, so you have 3 sons. Like, did you learn it right out of the gate with your oldest, or did it take?
It took a minute, but then. Yeah. So I think that I grew up with this version of feminism, which is like gender is all socialized. It's like the only reason why boys and girls behave differently is because we raise them differently and we give them different expectations. And they're like, boys will be boys. It's just like we let them off the hook. We're like, oh, just do whatever you want. And then when I had my own sons, I think, when he was a baby and a really young toddler, I think it was probably, I didn't notice a huge difference. But then as they grew into toddlerhood and beyond, and especially with 3 boys, I was blindsided by how wild my kids were. I was like, oh my God. And at the time, we had downstairs neighbors. We were living in this duplex. We were upstairs. I had at the time 2 boys and she had 2 girls, same ages. And the differences were just unbelievable. And it was just like every day I felt like such a failure. My kids were wild. They were breaking everything. They were like going crazy. They were running away at the park. They were like getting in fights. They were so physical, aggressive. And her girls would sit there and color and like they were independent. It was suddenly like, oh God. And it felt a bit like I'd walked into my own ideological trap. That's what I write in the book, because it's like, if I'd set it up, like the only reason boys are like this is because we let them behave like this, we don't parent them well, then
you're a failure.
I'm a failure. It's all my fault. Look at these lovely girls. They're downstairs. So I really struggled with it. And what I came to realize though is that I think there are some differences that are rooted in biology. And there's quite a fair amount of evidence to support that between boys and girls. And we're talking at a group level. There will always be exceptions. People always come back at me and say, but my boy was the calmest, easiest, least physical, and my girl was the wild one. And yes, all of that is true. But I think at a group level, there are differences. But what I realized was that actually we shouldn't be then saying, oh, well, that's just the way they are. They don't need anything else. This whole like boys are like dogs. I heard that a lot, which is like, oh, all they need is exercise, food, wear them out. They don't need that emotional engagement. They don't need that complexity. But actually, they need it all the more because of those biological differences.
That was super, super helpful for me. If it's any consolation, I can tell you, having raised 3 girls, mine fought like boys.
They did.
And they protected me from that because I think they knew I was a little fragile that way. They didn't tell me this until they were adults. We had many conversations like, oh yeah, Dad, we went at it. You weren't home. And there were fistfights. They're 3 of the best friends now, but I understand that as a group. I am one of 5 siblings, 2 brothers, 3 sisters. And in my own childhood growing up, I can definitely see the differences there.
Yeah. And we magnify the differences as well. The social piece is really real. And, it's the buddy sweetheart. We ask different things of them, or the buddy sweetheart principle magnified in a million different interactions through our lives. So it's like, yes, there are some differences rooted in biology. They're not definitive. They're tendencies. And then we amplify them over and over again.
How long has the book been out? When did it come out officially?
It came out on June 4th. So
this year. Yeah. I'm curious. It might be too early to tell, but what has been the feedback and response you've gotten from people about this? Because you're dealing obviously with a very volatile issue, especially in the time we find ourselves. What kind of feedback have you gotten?
So I've been really surprised by how positive how universally positive the feedback has been. Because, I mean, not universally, no, that's not true. There have been critiques, but I think that I thought that I would get extreme pushback from both the right and the left. I thought that I would get this kind of, every time as a woman, if you write something about feminism on the internet, you always get a bunch of like crazy men's rights activists emailing you saying they want to come and kill you in the night, or that you're like feminizing boys, or you're poor sons and you're a terrible mother. And so you expect a certain amount of that. And I've got a couple of those, but really far fewer than I have at other times that I've written stuff on the internet. And I thought I'd get a lot of pushback from the left, which was more like, why are you centering boys? There's so much work still to be done for women and girls. You're taking resources away from them. It's both sidesism. And I've had a few of those as well, but really far fewer than I thought. I think that people have been willing to listen in a way that I've been really encouraged by.
Do you think that's because you struck a nerve and like?
I think so. I think a lot of people are trying to come to terms with it. I think there was a moment around the time of Me Too when women were so angry that there wasn't really space. It was the moment to just express the hurt and anger and fear that they felt.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really a moment to reflect on how things have been difficult for men. That wasn't the time for it.
Yeah.
But I think we're a few years out now, and I think there's more nuance. I think a lot of people are raising boys and being like, this isn't a zero-sum game. It's not like you give to one and you're taking from the other. Giving to one means giving to both. The more we can look at this and break down these systems that are harming everybody, the better for all of us.
Why? So you mentioned a zero sum,
kind
of that mentality. And I see it too very often. Like, why is that such a persistent source of resistance to ideas like yours?
It's such an interesting question. I think we're in this moment, the culture wars, this huge polarization in our society. It's amplified by social media, where our communities are breaking down and we're becoming increasingly suspicious and hostile, and we assume bad faith in everybody else. And it's very hard to listen. And I think the cause of men and boys has somehow become really subtly coded as a kind of right-wing cause. So I think that in the Me Too moment, it felt like if you were on the left and you were progressive, then you were on the side of women and girls. You were fighting the cause of women and girls. And if you were on the right and conservative, then you were fighting the cause of men and boys. And it's ridiculous because we all live in this world together.
Yeah.
Somehow became coded that way. And so you start to hear somebody, we're all looking for these sort of dog whistles in the way that people talk, and these words like the word patriarchy. For you, it's interesting because you were already like, oh, she said the word patriarchy, that's going to trigger people. Or like there are certain words that like people on the right say, which kind of feel equally triggering for people on the left. And it's just like you hear something and then we shut down and we can't listen or have the conversation. And so it's difficult. I don't know exactly, but I think the best way to get past that is to try and empathize and to try and be like, and for me and people like me to say, okay, I'm on this side politically, but I want to listen to what you're obviously hurting here. You're obviously feeling stuff and that's legitimate. And I want to hear what it is.
That's such a humanizing posture that, you strike, as opposed to treating someone as the other, right? Like,
yeah. Well, I think I was forced into it. Had I had 3 girls, I'm sure I would be completely oblivious and uninterested in what was happening with men and boys. And in a way, I kind of joke, there's this like trope on the left where it's like Republican men who are only interested in women or realize that women are people when they have daughters. I don't know if you've heard of this, but that like daughter, it's like, as a father of daughters, I believe that
I'm probably guilty of some of that at one point or another. Yeah.
But then I realized that I'm also guilty of that. Until I had sons, all of this stuff was invisible to me. And honestly, with the first 2 sons, it was still invisible to me. I wasn't really thinking of it. And then it was only when we started having these like very intense conversations around Me Too, around toxic masculinity, that I really started to think, hang on a second, this is something we need to look at. And it's so invisible in so many ways.
Did you know with each son that you were having a boy or?
Yeah, I did. And so my first son, we found out at 20 weeks, I guess, at the regular ultrasound.
Yeah.
And then the second one, a little bit earlier. I think they improved the technology and we could find out. And then the third one we knew before I got pregnant because it was an embryo from IVF. And I think that's where the book opens, which is like, people were like, you are crazy. Why are you having a third boy? They were like, this was IVF. I had this embryo. I decided to go ahead knowing he was a boy.
Yeah.
And people were like, I can understand going through that for a girl, but why would you want another boy? And they would look at me, this potential mother of 3 boys, as if I'd said, we're all going off to war, or like, we've all got the stomach flu or something. It was just like this horrible negativity.
Wow. If you had had 3 daughters,
yeah,
what book would you have written in light of where the culture is now? What would the book be called?
That's such an interesting, I don't think I would have written the book BOYMOM. If I'd had 3 daughters, I probably would have written a book that was about nothing to do with any of this, honestly, because I think my politics would have just stayed so aligned. Everything would have been obvious. I wouldn't have been challenged in that way. And I think it's that challenge that provides the impetus to write the book. So I think I would have been like, well, yeah, of course the world is unfair to women and girls. And that's true. And I believe that. And it's very true in many ways. And I would have carried on fighting for it. But I would have just been like, yeah, well, that's obvious. I didn't need to write that book.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows what I would have been doing. But I probably would have been writing a book about, I don't know, marine life or something completely different. Or a nice novel about 3 girls who live in the country or something.
Yeah. That's so great.
Today, we're shouting out the book BOYMOM by our guest, Ruth Whitman. BOYMOM, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity, blending cultural criticism, memoir, and reporting from the front lines of contemporary American boyhood. This is a humorous and heartbreaking deep dive into the complexities of raising boys in our fraught political moment. The Times calls this book one of the most thought-provoking books they have read as parents. Please check it out by visiting ruthwhipman.com. That's Ruth, WHIPPMAN.com.
You back to that divide and that political divide it feels like it's growing so deep. You said for the left, masculinity is part of the problem. Liberals argue that we need less aggression, less unreconstructed manhood. In response, the right is digging in. For them, masculinity is not the problem, but the solution. The whole conversation speaks to a dark fear among conservatives that America itself is being emasculated. And you speak in several places, in several ways to that divide. My question for you is, without humble, thoughtful engagement on these issues from both sides, which honestly is what I feel you bring from the feminist progressive side, is humble, thoughtful engagement. But without that from both sides, where does this end?
I mean, I think it ends with us becoming increasingly fractured, suspicious. I think it could potentially end in fascism in this. Look, we have an election coming up and I'm very scared about another Trump presidency. I know everyone has different views on this, but personally, I'm scared about how that will roll back the freedoms and rights of women and our ideas of like what masculinity is. I think it will be terrible for this generation of women and for this generation of young men as well. And I think for boys, just this idea of masculinity is it's harmful for everybody else, but it's also harmful for them. I think we're giving them this impossible model for how to be in the world, for how to be human, which is so deeply unhealthy that I really fear for this generation of boys. They're already becoming increasingly angry, resentful, avoidant. This generation of boys is not doing well. They're isolated. They're moving to the right politically. They are increasingly involved in these like toxic spaces online. Yeah. And I think dialogue on both the left and the right is pushing them in this direction.
You took the red pill in your work on the book and you went there and engaged with those guys. What was that like for you? I'm really curious as a mom.
Well, as a mom, it was terrifying. But, in a strange way, and there's a scene in the book, right? So I have this chapter about incels, which if your listeners don't know about them, it's this group of involuntary celibates, they're called, these boys who they don't have sex, they desperately want women, and they often become very They take on these really toxic opinions. They have these like communities online. They're often extremely misogynistic. They have all these very scary views. And at their most extreme, at their sort of fringes, they've been associated with things like school shootings, with mass shootings, with these acts of mass violence. And before I started researching them for the book, there's a scene in the beginning of that chapter where I go to this therapist and she's like, I'm trying to talk to her about anxiety. And she does this exercise where it's like, if you think of your worst fear, take your fears all the way down to the end of the track. Like, what is your absolute worst fear? What are you picturing? And the idea is that, like, if you can articulate your worst fear, then you can
work backwards from that.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and I was like, what is my worst fear? And I looked, and in my mind, there was this incel standing at the end of the anxiety track being like, this is the worst case scenario, that my son would be involved in this, that he might become a school shooter. And I didn't really think that. I know my son, he's this wonderful, all three of them, they're these lovely, sensitive, wonderful people. And I didn't think that would happen. But we're like in such a horrible climate. I was like, this is my fear. And in a way, the process of researching it and actually digging into those manosphere spaces, I spent a lot of time on incel message boards and servers. I interviewed a few incels actually, but two very much in depth that end up in the book. And actually, in a way, for me, like confronting that fear, going in, finding out more, getting more information, seeing what's going on behind the sort of pain and the hurt that's driving these people into these roles actually felt healing to me. I felt like, it sounds crazy because in some ways it's like this horrible, depressing, awful reality, but something about actually engaging with these people on a human level felt like hopeful. I felt like if we are able to listen and help these people, they're very ready to be helped. That was my takeaway.
That is so counterintuitive.
It really is. I know.
Yeah. We had on an earlier episode, Pasha Dashgard from American University, whose work is focused on this kind of white supremacist, male supremacist extremism. So similar experiences, but hearing your experience of it is, I really appreciate it. There's a hope. You said it. Yeah, I didn't expect that.
No, I didn't expect it either. And one thing that became really clear as I was interviewing these guys was that I think we've done a lot of listening to men and boys' opinions. Like, we take male opinions very seriously, and that's a problem. And I think every woman I know will recognize that thing, that the man's opinion gets taken more seriously than the woman's, and that's an issue. But we've done a lot less time listening to the feelings that are driving them. So it's like we keep the conversation on this one level, which is like, so someone like an incel will be like, women are terrible and I hate women and they should all be tortured and raped and whatever. And then the impulse is to fight back and to be like, no, women are not terrible. They're wonderful and they should be whatever. And we should all be feminists. And we're keeping the conversation on this level of opinions. And in a sense, that keeps it exactly where these guys want it. But actually, what's driving them to be in these spaces is profound hurt, profound loneliness, lack of belonging, lack of connection, feelings of emasculation, feelings of not being enough, feelings of like trying to live up to this masculine ideal that they can't ever live up to. And once we start engaging on the levels of feelings, I found that those kind of opinions actually just crumbled a little bit.
Yeah.
They were still there, but it was like, actually, when we're talking human to human, like, what is your pain? Why are you here? What's hurting you? And I felt like we could have these really productive conversations. Even one of the incels I went very deep with, actually was quite a sweetheart, and I don't know how he'd ended up in this community, and it was really awful. The other one really did have some pretty toxic and awful opinions, but even him, it came from so much pain. This expectation that he was to be this strong, tough man and never measuring up. And he was so lonely and he was so disconnected, and he'd found community here in these spaces. And so, I think this was the very extreme example of what we've been talking about all along. But, just that like empathetic listening and trying to figure out, and these people wanted help. They didn't want to be where they were. They needed help desperately, and nobody was listening.
That is so fascinating, because that absolutely mirrors 10 years worth of experience that we've had with directly engaging, having direct personal conversations with active online sex buyers.
Oh.
So many of those same motivational currents exist in their lives as well. There is a complete lack of a sense of belonging. There's low self-esteem. There's isolation. Like, yeah, it mirrors exactly what we have experienced. And it's not, well, and I can tell you, just based on the data that we have and the kind of the broader research on sex buyers, that's not limited to young men.
That's interesting.
What you just described coming from young, lonely incels, like there's a lot of commonality between them and 60-something-year-old guys.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it's the same set of pressures. It's the same set of social prohibitions. And I think that these trends are ramping up in modern culture for various reasons. I think modern life is becoming more isolating. I think masculinity norms are becoming more caricatured and cartoonish. I think that screen time, porn, all of these things, I think it's pushing these things in more directions, it's accelerating these trends. But I think you're absolutely right. They were there all along. And it is the same thing for a 60-year-old guy and for a 18-year-old.
Yeah, I have found, I mean, this is partly my own story. Just I turned 64 this fall, and I grew up in that culture. I am that guy's guy in a sense. And yet there are many times in my life, especially since I started working with survivors of sex trafficking, this is where I've learned a lot of it. But like, I'm tired of carrying those expectations and still trying to live up in many ways to those set of expectations. And yeah, I mean, and for me, it's a lifetime of being told, suck it up. Right?
Yeah. Right. And that's so unhealthy. I mean, it's so damaging for a person to suppress their emotions for so long. You can see why this comes out in violence, why this comes out in shame. Yeah. And one of the things that was really interesting that I found in the book was that it's not masculinity itself that makes men violent. It's what they call masculine discrepancy stress. It's this like academic name for basically the feeling that you're not masculine enough. Yeah. It's like this shame that you're not living up to this impossible ideal.
I call that a masculine mythology. We've been taught, a mythological construct of what a man should be. And like with me, even though I might check some of those boxes, like I never felt like that.
Yeah, so, nobody can. I mean, nobody can live up to what the expectation of masculinity is because it is literally impossible. It's superhuman. It's not, the model is a superhero who has literal superhuman powers and a body that looks nothing like any human body and like a strength that no human has and no emotions and no vulnerability and no flaws and no weaknesses. And that's nobody.
It's that same tension that I know young girls and women face to live up to. Right. There's another standard there too.
Absolutely. And we feel as a women growing up, there definitely is this idea that you have to be perfect. You have to have a perfect body. You have to look beautiful, that you be judged on it. And so there are these impossible standards for women. And I think, and we've done a good job. It's still, these things are still very real in our culture, but I think there's a real discourse around it. I think women feel able to call it out now. They're like, oh God, these impossible pressures. Everyone knows what you mean. Everyone can talk about it. There's this way. And I think that women, we have greater access to community and friends that we can discuss this stuff with. But I think with the masculinity stuff, it's like the ideal is that you're this strong individual that you can't even talk about it. That's like written into the script. And so it's so isolating.
I remember as a 8th grade boy in football practice one day, not doing a particular drill correct, and my coach lining up across from me and hitting me in the drill, dislocating my finger.
Oh my gosh.
And I quickly grabbed it and put it back in place. When you don't cry, you just go with practice. I got in the car. My dad picked me up from practice that day, and I'm fighting back tears. And I told him what happened. And you think about that happening now, right? Like,
no, it's abuse. I mean, that is abuse.
Yeah. Well, my dad, and this is how he was raised. I'm sure how his dad was raised, but my dad's response to me was, well, what did you do wrong, son?
Oh gosh. Yeah.
And I remember that message in that experience to me just cemented what I was suspicious of, like big boys don't cry.
Yes.
And now I have to tell the end.
Yeah.
I have to tell the end of that story because my dad changed dramatically over the course of his life.
Wow.
I mean, he never during that season, I can't remember him saying even like, I love you, son.
Wow.
But literally the last words that my dad spoke to me was, I love you, son. And the reason I remember it is because by that time, it was so normal. I had heard it so many times. I'm like, yeah, I know.
What was it that made him change, do you think?
I think he was a deeply introspective person. He almost died in his early 70s of a massive heart attack, but lived till his mid 90s.
Wow.
And I think that gave him a new lease on life. But I think he thought a lot about how he showed up in the world as a man.
It's so impressive. I mean, I have to say, I have so much admiration for the men who are doing this work, either personally or in the culture, who are thinking about this stuff, because there are so many ways that it's really difficult for them to show up in that way. There are so many costs. You've been given this message your whole life, which is like your worth rests on your masculinity and being a certain way. So then I'm so admiring of the men who are able to like ask for something different. And the boys, like some of the boys I interviewed for this book, some of them were also doing this stuff and showing up in really interesting ways. Like there was a guy that I talked to, and he was in the New York Times piece I wrote, where he was on Discord, this like social, and it was like all these lonely men and boys on there. And he became this like unofficial therapist on the server. Like he was having conversations over and over again. He had like 200 conversations with like people, serious mental health problems, suicidal thoughts, terrible things. He wasn't a trained therapist. He was a depressed guy himself, but he was just like, I'm going to do what I can. I'm going to show up in that way. And now he's actually trained as a real mental health counselor. But, and there were many stories like that of boys and men just like breaking out and deciding to do things differently. And I'm full of admiration for it.
Yeah. I'm asking this selfishly, quite honestly, but what's your encouragement to older guys who are thinking about these things and wrestling with these things? What wisdom can you share with, because the focus of this was on younger men, and that's as it should be. But I know personally, but I know from conversations I have with men, this is something a lot of us are thinking about.
Well, I think firstly, you're not alone. Every man that I've talked to in some way or another is wrestling with this same thing in some capacity, some in different ways than others. And it's okay to change. Give yourself the permission to do things differently. Lots and lots of men are. We're trying to change the culture. It's really brave and hard work to do that, but you can, and you can reach out to other men. You can reach out to women. You can reach out to groups. There are like resources for you. And it's like, it's a really brave and impressive thing to do your part to change that culture and that in yourself. And and I speak for many people that I am full of admiration for anyone who's doing that. Yeah. Full of admiration for people who are trying to change it.
I appreciate that. And I think my motivation for change is just, I want to live what's left of my life in a healthier culture. But I also I think of my grandsons and my granddaughter, but it's like, what kind of world will we leave them?
Yeah, which is, it's wonderful that you're thinking about that. And it's interesting because I hear a lot of women talk about around menopause or like later in life that they're just like, screw this. I'm sick of like trying to be the perfect everything and to look perfect and to care what men think and to care. And it's very freeing. And I hope for that for men as well, to just be like, screw these pressures. We can do this differently. We don't have to live up to this impossible ideal. We have choices here. And I think it's wonderful that you're thinking about that for future generations of boys and men.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You said something towards the end of the book, and I scribbled a whole bunch of stuff, but I wrote in large letters, me. Honest, but let me start at the beginning, talking about the system, and it was a reference, I think, more to patriarchy. But she said, at some deep level in this system, men get everything except the thing that's most worth having, and that is human intimacy.
It's so true. Yeah. I mean, this is when we start talking about male privilege and patriarchy and how it benefits men. And it's true. There are real benefits. You get paid more, you get power, you get a seat in the boardroom. But actually, those aren't really the things that people look back on and feel were the most important things. The most important thing in a well-lived life is meaningful relationships with other people. And so much men lose out on that so much in this system.
Wait, I thought it was money and power. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, right. We think, and this, it becomes this circular thing, which is, it goes back to what we said at the beginning of this conversation, which is like male concerns are centered where others are marginalized. So men value money and power. So therefore everybody thinks that money and power is what we should be aiming for. And then we don't see it as a loss that men don't have access to emotions and intimacy. They're coded as feminine, so we just trivialize them. We think they're not worth having.
That's so helpful. We code certain things as feminine.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, boy, that happens at so many levels. Can
it's
you,
so true.
you say more? You say more about that?
Right, because we think at some level that the sort of being emotional, being intimate with your friends, talking about your feelings, being vulnerable, we code that as a feminine quality. So therefore, we don't recognize it as having so much value. We don't, but actually, we code things like power and aggression and agency as being masculine qualities. So we value them more. So traditional feminism, we're like, let's give women more access to power. Let's help women become more powerful and more strong and assertive and all of those things. And we're not really talking about it flowing in the other direction, which is like, let's help men become more emotional, connected, have more meaningful relationships.
Yeah.
And so I think, obviously, these things, I think once we talk about them as masculine and feminine qualities, we end up like reinforcing this idea that these things are not just for everybody. I mean, all of these things are human. Every human needs to connect. Every human has emotions. Every human wants to feel powerful at certain points and to do well economically and all of those things. And so I would much rather, instead of saying this is masculine, this is feminine, that we're just like, this is human and we all need all of this.
Yeah. I have heard over and over again in my life that men, they don't feel things. They don't have emotions. They don't express emotions. And I can tell you, we have all the feelings. We just haven't been taught what to do with them.
It's so true. And how to name them, how to process them, how to think about them, how to believe that anyone else cares about them. And so, yeah.
We could go on all afternoon. I want to give you the last word, but I'm going to set you up just a little bit if I can.
Of course.
On the day that your youngest son, this is hypothetical, but
okay.
On the day that your youngest son heads off to college,
yes,
what do you want to see as the biggest change in the culture of men? What do you hope to be different for him the day he goes off to college?
Wow, what a great question. I hope that he will have the social permission in a very deep way to be fully human. So to have an emotional side, to form intimate connections, to pursue whatever he wants in his life in terms of relationships, in terms of emotions, in terms of career, in terms of his sense of self, that he wants to. And that is not, I don't mean this in a kind of the sky's the limit. I want him to like aim for the stars and be a rock star or be a CEO. I want him to be a fully connected human being in the world who's part of a community, and for that to be very normal.
Ruth, you're a blessing. You're a sage. This is my copy and no one can have it, but where people want to read this, where can they find it, Ruth?
So the book is called BOYMOM, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. You can buy it wherever you buy books. And if you want to follow me online, I have a Substack, which is called I Blame Society, where I write about masculinity, about men, about gender, and all kinds of other things. So I hope you will check it out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast with your host, Tom Perez. This podcast is a production of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disrupting the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and dismantling the forces that perpetuate it. I'm your producer, Lauren Trantham. Special shout out to our favorite logo designer, Michelle Boucher, as well as Wes Finley, who crafted and donated our amazing theme song. Interested in sponsoring an episode? Send us an email at podcast@epicproject.org. That's podcast@epikproject.org. As a nonprofit organization, your donations allow us not only to produce this podcast and change the conversation around sexual exploitation, but also to manage our many programs, such as buyer intervention, teen prevention, and community education. Your support also allows us to support survivors of exploitation and more. To learn more about our work and to donate, visit www.epicproject.org. Once again, that is www.epikproject.org. Most importantly, this podcast would be nothing without you, the listener. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for your commitment to learning more about the issues that affect our most vulnerable populations. Thank you for navigating this masculine wilderness with us. See you next episode.